Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that has been quietly brewing in the heart of the Amazon for longer than most of recorded history. Ayahuasca, the ancient jungle ritual behind one of the most intense trips on Earth. Not the polished wellness retreat version with a welcome smoothie and a liability waiver. Not the co-worker who went to Peru for 10 days and now somehow steers every single conversation back to their spirit animal. I mean the real thing. A thick, bitter brown brew, a very long night in total darkness, and a plant that, according to the people who know it best, wants to have a word with you. A serious word. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. A heartfelt thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas honestly shape everything I make here, and this whole channel grows because of the strange and wonderful things you send my way. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, and if you'd rather drift off with just your ears, the channel is now on Spotify too, linked down in the description. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered how anyone, thousands of years ago, surrounded by an entire rainforest of roughly 80,000 plant species, somehow landed on the exact two you needed to combine, in the exact way to make this work? Did the shamans really learn the recipe from the plants themselves, or is that just the sort of thing plants tell you? What does it actually feel like to spend an entire night being gently, thoroughly reorganized from the inside by a vine? Would you last one single ceremony without either sobbing about your father or forming a deep personal relationship with a plastic bucket? Could you sit perfectly still in pitch darkness for 6 hours with nothing but your own unfinished business and a jungle that suddenly seems very awake? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in a thatched hut deep in the Amazon, somewhere the maps politely gave up. The air is warm and green and smells like rain that never fully leaves. It is nearly dark. Someone across the room is stirring a pot that has been simmering all day, and you are about to be introduced to a plant that knows several things about you that you have never told a living soul. Good luck. Before we crawl into the darkness together, let's get one thing straight about what ayahuasca actually is. Because the fantasy and the reality are standing in two very different rooms. Ayahuasca is a brew, a drink, a thick and frankly unfriendly looking liquid brewed from parts of the Amazon rainforest and simmered down over long hours into something the colour of wet bark and roughly the flavour of regret. It is not a party favour. Nobody in the traditional world was passing it around at a celebration and giggling. It was, and still is, treated as a medicine and a ceremony rolled into one long sleepless night. The name itself in the Quechua language points at something bigger than a beverage, something closer to a vine of the soul. And whatever you believe about souls, one thing is not up for debate. People have been drinking this stuff on purpose for a very, very long time. To understand why, you have to understand the world it came from. The Amazon basin is not a tidy place. It is enormous, humid, ancient, and alive in ways that people who grew up with central heating tend to underestimate. It has been home to human beings for tens of thousands of years, and those human beings, living deep inside one of the most complex ecosystems on Earth, spent those millennia paying very close attention to their surroundings. Not in a casual, pleasant, Sunday afternoon sort of way. In a this forest will kill you if you stop paying attention sort of way. They learned plants because their lives depended on it. And over generations they built up a body of knowledge so detailed, so nuanced, and so carefully maintained that modern researchers are still catching up with it today. Within that vast body of knowledge, certain plants occupied a different category entirely. Not food, not simple medicine, but something more like a technology of the mind, tools for seeing what ordinary waking life kept hidden. These were the plants that let you speak to the forest, consult the unseen, diagnose illness at a level that went deeper than fever or a broken bone. In many Amazonian traditions, illness was never purely physical. Something could be wrong in a person's spirit, in their relationships, in the web of invisible forces that surrounded them, and a brew like ayahuasca was how you found out what it was and, hopefully, what to do about it. So when you try to put ayahuasca in a box, it keeps refusing. It is not a drug in the way the modern world uses that word, not a recreational chemical, not a shortcut, not a novelty. It's a practice that stretches back further than almost any institution you can think of, tended by people who are neither reckless nor naive, surrounded by centuries of carefully accumulated understanding. The bitter taste is real, the difficulty of the night is real, and the healing that traditions say it brings is, for the people who have relied on it across generations, equally real. Whether you believe in plant spirits or not, you're looking at something ancient and serious and deeply human, and that, before you learn a single other thing about it, is worth sitting quietly with for a moment. Here is the part that keeps botanists awake at night, staring at their ceilings. The Amazon is not a tidy garden. It is a chaotic, dripping, endless sprawl of tens of thousands of plant species, many of them mildly poisonous, most of them completely useless for making a person feel anything at all. And yet, somewhere in the deep past, human beings figured out that if you took one specific woody vine and combined it with the leaves of one specific unrelated shrub and treated them just so, you got something extraordinary. Not one plant, not by accident, but two, working together like a lock and a key. The odds of stumbling onto that combination by random chance are so absurd that even the scientists throw up their hands. When you ask the traditional peoples how they knew, the answer is calm and unbothered. The plants told them. Try arguing with that at 2 a.m. in the jungle. The numbers alone should give you pause. Botanists estimate there are somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 plant species in the Amazon. To find any 2 of them from that number and correctly identify that combining them in a specific preparation produces a unique biochemical result, the like of which neither plant achieves alone, is not something that happens through trial and error in any reasonable span of time. Statistically, you would need to try combinations essentially forever, and yet here we are, with a preparation that works with precise, elegant, and frankly embarrassing efficiency. The traditional explanation that the plants communicated their properties directly to human beings through the visions themselves is not scientific, but it is also, honestly, not obviously crazier than the alternative. Consider what systematic trial and error would actually look like in practice. You are in the jungle. You have no equipment, no laboratory, no notebook, no theoretical framework, and a surrounding forest that is comprehensively trying to eat you. You pick up a vine. You try it alone. Nothing dramatic. You pick up a leaf. You try it alone. Also nothing dramatic, thanks to a metabolic quirk neither you nor anyone around you understands yet. At some point, across what would have to be an enormous span of time and patience, someone combines them. And then the real challenge begins, because you have to recognize that what happened was meaningful rather than dangerous. Repeat it consistently enough to establish that it was the combination producing the effect, and then teach that to someone else in a way that survives the next 10 generations intact. Every link in that chain is astonishing. The whole chain together is something else entirely. The honest answer is that nobody knows exactly how it happened, and the traditions do not consider that a gap in knowledge. The gap is ours. What the Amazon peoples have always understood is that the forest is not inert. It is not a passive backdrop to human activity. It has its own intelligence, its own relationships, its own logic, and human beings who live within it long enough, quietly enough, and attentively enough, begin to participate in something they did not design. The two plants were not discovered. By the account of the people who know them best, they introduced themselves, and given that those people have been right about virtually everything else they say about the forest, it is worth, at minimum, not immediately dismissing them. Let's introduce the star of the show, or at least the plant that gave the whole thing its name. It is a thick, twisting woody vine that climbs through the canopy like a slow-motion snake, and the locals call it, among many other names, the vine of the dead or the spirit vine. On its own, it will not exactly rearrange your life. Chewed or brewed by itself, it is bitter, earthy, and comes with a heavy, grounding sort of quality that some describe as being firmly pressed into the earth by a large, patient hand. But this vine is not really the fireworks. It is the doorman. It is the plant that quietly makes the whole experience possible, and without it, the other half of the recipe would slide straight through you and out the other side with nothing to show for it. More on that unfortunate little detail later. For now, just respect the vine. It has been holding this door open for millennia. In the forest, the vine looks like it belongs. It wraps itself around the trunks of older trees, following the light upward with a calm persistence that, once you know what you're looking at, starts to seem almost intentional. It can grow to impressive lengths, and its bark, when cut, reveals a cross-section that traditional practitioners have long used as a kind of visual symbol, concentric rings of fibrous wood that, if you squint and feel inclined toward metaphor, do look a little like a passageway. The vine is harvested with care, usually by experienced hands who know not just which plant to take, but how much, from where, and with what ritual acknowledgement to the plant itself. In many traditions, you do not simply hack off a vine and walk away. You ask permission, give thanks, and take only what you need. The forest, the traditions hold, is paying attention. The sections of vine that make it into the brew are typically the bark and the inner wood, cleaned, cut, and then pounded before going into the pot. The pounding matters because it breaks open the plant material and allows more of its contents to dissolve into the water during the long cook. People who have spent time around the preparation describe the smell of fresh vine as green and a little astringent, not unpleasant, not remarkable, nothing that would suggest it is about to participate in something extraordinary. But that is the vine's character generally. It is quiet. It is patient. It does not announce itself. It simply waits in the pot, releasing what it has, and hours later it is woven into something that will make a room full of people rethink everything they thought they understood about the inside of their own minds. Not a flashy entrance, but an unforgettable result. In many Amazonian traditions, the vine is treated almost as a person, an elder, a grandmother figure in some tellings, wise and grounding and not particularly interested in making things comfortable for you. It is the part of the experience that holds you down, that keeps you tethered to something even when the visions spin out into territory that feels unnavigable. Without it, there is no ceremony. Without it, the other plant has no voice. The vine earned its name not through spectacle, but through the slow, irreplaceable work of making everything else possible. Every doorman deserves more credit than they get. Now meet the vine's partner, the plant that actually brings the visions to the party. It is a modest, unassuming shrub with glossy green leaves, the kind of thing you would walk straight past on a jungle trail without a second glance. And that is exactly the point. On its own, the leaf keeps its secrets locked in a vault, because your own body carries a diligent little enzyme whose entire job is to break down the leaf's active ingredient before it can do anything interesting. Swallow the leaf alone and your stomach shrugs, disassembles the whole thing, and moves on with its day. It is only when the leaf meets the vine that the magic clicks into place, because the vine, cleverly, tells that diligent little enzyme to take the night off. Two plants, one turns the key, the other opens the door, and somehow ancient people cracked this without a single test tube. The shrub goes by various names across the traditions, but it's found widely through the Amazon, a mid-level plant that grows in the dappled light beneath the forest canopy. Its leaves are oval, smooth, and unremarkable in appearance, roughly the size of an adult hand. In the jungle, where everything tends toward the dramatic, whether in colour or toxicity or architectural ambition, this plant is almost aggressively ordinary-looking. It blends in. It does not reach for the light with any particular urgency. It sits there in the forest being a shrub, doing shrub things, holding one of the more remarkable secrets in the plant kingdom without any visible sign of it. The jungle is full of understatement. What the leaf contains, waiting quietly behind that metabolic lock, is a compound that belongs to a family of molecules found, fascinatingly, in many other organisms and even within the human body itself. Its presence in the brain has been documented, though what it does there under normal circumstances remains genuinely uncertain. In the context of the brew, it is this compound that produces the visions, the intensity, the sense of contact with something beyond the ordinary waking world. It is the leaf's gift and the leaf's secret, and it gives nothing up without the vine's cooperation. Every teacher needs the right conditions to teach. The leaf needed the vine before it could speak. The leaves are typically prepared fresh or dried, stripped from their stems, and added to the pot alongside the vine material. Some traditions layer them in alternating strata with the pounded vine, an arrangement that experienced brewers say affects both the potency and the character of the final medicine. The ratios are not standardized in any formal way. They live in the memory and judgment of the person doing the brewing, calibrated through years of experience and, by the traditional account, through ongoing guidance from the plants themselves. There is no recipe card. There is no standardized measurement. There is only knowledge held in human hands and passed between them, adjusted for the particular group, the particular night, the particular need. Which sounds impossibly imprecise, until you consider that it has been working, reliably and repeatedly, for longer than most human institutions have existed. You do not simply buy ayahuasca off a shelf and wing it, at least not traditionally, and not if you value your evening. The entire ceremony revolves around one person, the shaman, the healer, the ayahuasquero, the one who knows the plants, the songs, the spirits, and crucially, what to do when someone across the hut begins loudly negotiating with the ceiling. This was not a job you applied for with a nice resume. It was a calling, a burden, and a decades-long commitment that most sane people would run screaming from. The shaman was doctor, priest, therapist, and night shift supervisor all at once, responsible not just for brewing the medicine, but for steering a room full of emotionally exposed humans safely through the longest night of their lives. No pressure, just everyone's psyche in your hands until sunrise. In the communities where this tradition lives, the shaman was one of the most important people in the village. Not in a merely ceremonial sense, not in the way a figurehead is important, but in the way that a doctor is important, or an engineer who maintains the one bridge in town. People went to the shaman when they were sick in ways that ordinary remedies could not touch, when a family was unravelling and nobody could say why, when crops failed and the cause seemed to reach beyond the merely practical. The shaman was the person who could see what others could not, who had spent years learning to navigate the unseen world and return from it with information that was useful in this one, That is a significant thing to ask of anyone. The societies that asked it understood this and surrounded the role with corresponding respect. The range of what a shaman was expected to handle would exhaust most professionals in any field. Diagnosing spiritual illness, which in the traditional understanding could manifest as physical disease, interpersonal conflict, or a community-wide bad run of luck. Mediating disputes with the forest, a concept that sounds strange from outside the worldview and entirely practical from within it. Guiding people through ceremonies that could turn frightening or complicated in ways that required immediate, calm, expert intervention. Identifying which plants to use for which ailment across a pharmacopoeia that numbered in the hundreds of species. Maintaining relationships with the various spirits and forces that the tradition understood as real, present, and capable of being either helpful or destructive depending on how you treated them. And doing all of this without losing their own mind in the process, which, given the territory, is perhaps the most impressive part. There were female shamans too, though the particulars varied widely by region and tradition. Some communities primarily trained men, others had strong traditions of female healers, and in many places the gender of the practitioner was simply less important than the quality of the knowledge they carried. What unified the role across its many local variations was its fundamental seriousness. This was not a hobby. It was not a side project. It was a life's work, entered into with full awareness of what it would cost, and maintained through continuous practice, continuous learning, and continuous relationship with the plants themselves. The shaman did not graduate and retire. They kept working, kept learning, and kept showing up in the dark year after year for as long as their community needed them. So how did you become one of these plant-whispering night shift supervisors? Not by watching a weekend workshop. The traditional path to becoming a shaman was long, lonely, and about as fun as it sounds, which is to say, not remotely. It often meant years of isolation in the forest, strict restrictions on food and pleasure, and repeated apprenticeship with the plants themselves, learning their songs, their temperaments, and their apparently very specific personalities. Some traditions held that you had to learn from each plant individually, spending long stretches consuming and studying one at a time, as though building a very slow, very intense friend group made entirely of vegetation. It was grueling, it was humbling, and there was no graduation ceremony, no certificate to frame. Just the quiet, terrifying moment when the elders decided you were ready to hold the room. And the plants apparently had opinions on that too. The apprenticeship could begin in childhood if the signs were right. In many traditions, candidates were identified early, sometimes through unusual experiences, vivid or prophetic dreams, or a particular sensitivity to the world that the elders recognized as meaningful. Being selected was not necessarily welcome news. It came with obligations that would define the rest of your life, and the early years of training were deliberately austere. Food restrictions, sexual abstinence, extended periods alone in the forest. The idea was to strip away ordinary comforts and distractions until the apprentice became quiet enough, empty enough, to actually hear what the plants had to say, which apparently required quite a lot of silence. The forests of the Amazon are loud, and yet this kind of listening was understood as an interior act, a practice of becoming still enough inside that external information could register. The formal learning happened in multiple channels simultaneously. There was the oral transmission from the senior shaman, who shared plant knowledge, ceremonial protocols, and the histories and personalities of the various spirits the apprentice would need to work with. There was the direct experience of repeated ceremonies, learning to navigate the territory from the inside, map by humbling map. And there was the dieta, extended periods of working with individual plants under strict conditions, during which the plant was understood to communicate its knowledge directly, through visions, through dreams, through a gradual felt sense of its nature and its gifts. Each plant had its own curriculum. Each took however long it took. You did not rush the lesson. The Icaros, the sacred songs, were perhaps the most critical thing to master, and they were learned one by one over many years. Some shamans said they received songs in dreams. Others said they heard them rising from the plants themselves during ceremony. However they arrived, they had to be learned precisely and retained perfectly, because in the middle of a difficult ceremony, with a room full of people depending on you, forgetting the words was not an option. The songs were the tools, the knowledge was the practice, and the character required to hold all of it without breaking was the thing the years of isolation were really building. By the time an apprentice was considered ready to work alone, they had been systematically remade from the inside out. Not once, over and over again. That was the education. Long before anyone drinks a single drop, there is the dieta, and if you were hoping the suffering started with the brew, I have bad news. The dieta was a period of preparation, sometimes days, sometimes far longer, in which participants gave up an entire list of earthly comforts. Salt, gone. Sugar, gone. Spicy food, gone. Alcohol, obviously gone. Certain meats, fats, and, depending on tradition, quite a lot of what makes food worth eating, all cheerfully removed. And that is before we get to the other renunciations, which often included giving up, shall we say, romantic activity as well. The idea was to arrive clean, empty and undistracted, a blank page for the medicine to write on. The reality for most was a few days of grumpiness, hunger, and staring longingly at a salt shaker you're no longer allowed to touch. Purification, it turns out, is mostly just being politely miserable on purpose. The restrictions were not arbitrary, even when they felt it. Each prohibition had a rationale rooted in the tradition's understanding of how the medicine worked and what it needed from you in order to work well. Salt was believed to interfere with the plant's ability to open certain channels. Heavily processed or strongly flavoured foods were understood as stimulating and distracting, pulling the mind toward the body's appetites at precisely the moment you needed the mind to go somewhere else entirely. Alcohol was simply incompatible with any serious ceremony in virtually every tradition that practiced them, a baseline observation that required no theoretical framework to arrive at. The more esoteric restrictions, which in some dietas extended to avoiding sunlight, avoiding skin contact with other people, and even avoiding crossing running water, were about maintaining a certain kind of energetic integrity, a state of careful separateness from ordinary life that made the subsequent opening more complete. For a serious apprentice shaman, the dieta could last months or even years for a single plant. This was not preparation for one ceremony. It was preparation as a way of life, the permanent background condition of someone whose work required constant access to a kind of clarity that ordinary living tended to muddy. The restrictions in these extended dietas were severe by any standard. Highly limited food, often just plain cooked plantain and occasional fish, no salt, no sweets, no contact with anyone outside the immediate teaching relationship. Months of this, in the forest, alone. The point, the tradition consistently explained, was that the plant needed your full attention and your full openness, and full attention and full openness could not coexist with a busy, comfortable, well-salted life. Something had to go. For participants rather than practitioners, the dieta before a ceremony was shorter, typically 3 days to a week, and somewhat less severe. But it was still real, still practiced, still insisted upon by any serious practitioner worth their title. The people who skipped it or dismissed it as superstition tended to report harder ceremonies, more chaotic visions, more difficulty integrating what they experienced. The people who honoured it tended to describe something smoother, more navigable, more meaningful. Whether that was pharmacology or psychology or something neither word quite captures, the practical result was consistent enough that the tradition had maintained the practice across centuries without modification. When something works that reliably for that long, even a skeptic should probably take it seriously, even if it means a week without hot sauce. Making the brew was not a quick job, and it was never meant to be. Preparing ayahuasca traditionally meant hours upon hours of labour over an open fire, tending a pot that had to be watched, stirred and coaxed for the better part of a day. Now, I am not about to hand you a recipe, and truthfully, neither would the people who guard these traditions, because in their world the how is sacred, protected, and earned rather than downloaded. What matters for our sleepy purposes is the atmosphere of it. Picture the smoke curling into the trees, the slow reduction of something enormous into something small and potent, the patience of it, the sheer unhurried devotion. It was less like cooking dinner and more like tending a fire that you fully expected to talk back to you. By the end, what remained was a dark, concentrated, deeply bitter liquid, and a cook who was extremely tired. The fire itself was important. Open flame cooking over wood was not merely pragmatic in the absence of gas ranges. The heat was understood as a living element, and the fire was treated with corresponding respect. In some traditions, specific types of wood were preferred, woods whose smoke was considered clean or compatible with the medicine being made. The fire was tended continuously throughout the cooking, which could run anywhere from several hours to many more depending on the tradition and the amount being prepared. Someone always had to be present, watching the level of the liquid, adding water as needed, adjusting the heat, making sure the slow reduction proceeded without burning, without boiling too fast, without the kind of distracted inattention that turns a day's work into a ruined pot. This was careful, physical, meditative labour. The plants went into the pot in layers, alternating vine and leaf, covered with water and left to cook down. As the hours passed, the liquid darkened, thickening and concentrating, its smell changing from something merely earthy and green to something more complex, more insistent, harder to ignore. People who have been present at traditional preparations often describe the smell of ayahuasca cooking as something that fills the air in a way that is difficult to escape. Not unpleasant exactly, but persistent in the way that smoke is persistent. It announces itself. It follows you. By the time the brew was ready, everyone in the vicinity had been living with that smell for hours, which was part of the preparation in its own right. A gradual familiarization, a slow introduction. What came out of the pot, finally reduced to the appropriate concentration, was strained and stored, typically in simple containers. Dark brown, thick, and intensely bitter in ways that no description fully prepares you for. In some traditions, the brew was further reduced for smaller, more potent doses. In others, it was used at the consistency of the initial reduction. The shaman tasted and adjusted and made judgments about strength that were entirely internal, held in the knowledge of the body after years of experience. There was no instrument, no pH strip, no reliable external measure of potency. Just the shaman's accumulated understanding of what the medicine should feel and taste like when it was ready. And then the fire went out. The pot was set aside, and the ceremony waited for the dark. If the shaman is the captain, the Icaros are the steering wheel. These are the sacred songs, the melodies and chants sung throughout the ceremony, and they are not background music. In the traditions, the Icaros do real work, calling in helpful spirits, calming frightened participants, guiding the direction of the visions, and, when things get rough, pulling someone gently back from the edge of a particularly bad hour. Each song was said to belong to a specific plant, a specific purpose, learned over those long, lonely years of apprenticeship. In the pitch-black hut, with no light and no clock and no sense of time, the sound of the shaman singing was often the only thread connecting a person to the ordinary world. Imagine being emotionally airborne with no map, and the only navigation system is a voice in the dark, humming a tune older than your entire family tree. The Icaros are not improvised. They are precise, learned and maintained across generations with care equal to the preservation of any sacred text. Each one has its own melody, its own words, its own function, and experienced shamans carry dozens or hundreds of them, selecting throughout the night in response to what they perceive happening in the room. If the energy of the ceremony shifted, the shaman shifted with it, moving from one song to another as smoothly as a doctor switches tools mid-procedure. The analogy is apt. The Icaros were understood not as performance, but as medicine in their own right, with the sound itself doing a kind of work that could not be accomplished through any other means. Sound, in many Amazonian traditions, is not merely a sensory experience. It is a force. The shaman typically used a fan made of dried leaves, called a chacapa, alongside the songs, shaking it rhythmically through the air, using its sound to direct, cleanse and focus the energy of the ceremony. The combined effect of voice and rhythm in total darkness, with the brew already well underway, produced something that participants consistently describe as feeling guided, held, navigated. Not by the logic of words, but by something more physical and more immediate. Sound moving through air, moving through a darkened room filled with people whose perceptions were wide open and whose ordinary defences were temporarily offline. The shaman singing in that context was doing something that has no precise equivalent in any other therapeutic or spiritual tradition, and it worked, consistently, across centuries, in the dark. Learning an Icaro required more than memorising a melody. The traditional understanding was that the song could only be truly learned from the plant itself, during the dieta, in the particular state of receptivity that the long isolation and restriction had produced. You could hear another shaman sing it and copy the notes, but that version the tradition held would be hollow. A song learned from the plant was different in quality, in power, and in effect from a song merely imitated. Whether or not that distinction has any meaning outside of the traditional worldview, experienced ceremonial participants frequently reported being able to tell the difference. Some shamans' songs felt to them like a hand on the shoulder, others felt like wallpaper. The plants apparently gave better lessons than even the best human teachers. Ceremonies happened at night, and not by accident. Darkness was the whole point. In the traditional setting, everyone gathered in a communal space, often a round thatched structure, and settled in for the long haul as the last of the daylight drained out of the jungle. There were no candles blazing, no comforting glow, just black, and the enormous living soundtrack of the rainforest at night, which, if you have never heard it, is not the peaceful nature recording you might imagine. It is loud, it is insistent, it is thousands of insects and frogs and unseen things all announcing themselves at once. Into that darkness came the smells of smoke and mapacho tobacco, the rustle of people settling onto mats, and the quiet clink of the cup being prepared. Everyone knew what was coming. Nobody looked especially relaxed about it. The maloka, as the ceremonial structure is often called in many traditions, was not a casual space. It was built with intention, designed specifically for this purpose and maintained as something distinct from ordinary living space. Circular or octagonal in many traditions, open to the air at the sides but roofed against rain, large enough to hold a group with room between each person for the particular geography of a difficult night. It was a container in more than the architectural sense. It was the boundary of the ceremony, the vessel that held everyone inside the same shared experience, even as each person travelled somewhere entirely private. The shaman typically positioned at the centre or at one end, the participants arranged around them, each with a mat, a bucket, a blanket, and whatever they needed to survive until morning. Mapacho, a traditional tobacco of the Amazon that is distinct from commercial cigarettes, and treated by the traditions as a medicine in its own right, played a central role in the ceremony's opening. The shamans smoked it deliberately, using the smoke to cleanse the space, themselves, and sometimes the participants before anything was consumed. The smell of mapacho is thick and rich, and completely unlike what you know from a cigarette pack, and it functioned as a kind of atmospheric marker, a signal to the space itself that something significant was about to begin. Participants described the smell of it as grounding, anchoring, a last handhold on the ordinary world before the night took them somewhere else. Then came the waiting that preceded the waiting. The shaman organised themselves, arranged the brew, attended to any final preparations, and there was often a period of quiet instruction, a brief orientation for participants about what to expect and how to work with what came up. Not reassurance exactly, more like a pre-flight safety demonstration on a plane whose destination nobody could quite specify. And then the jungle filled in the silence around the ceremony, frogs and insects and the wet darkness of the Amazon night pressing in from all sides, and the shaman lifted the cup and the night began. And then comes the moment nobody looks forward to, actually drinking the thing. One by one, participants would approach the shaman, receive their measured portion in a small cup, and drink. There is no gentle way to describe the flavour. People reach for words like bitter, like rot, like the inside of a tree that has given up, like drinking the concept of a swamp. It is thick and it clings and it announces its presence at the back of the throat with real conviction. Most people fight the urge to bring it straight back up before it has even finished going down, and then you hand back the cup, return to your spot on the floor and you wait, sitting in the dark with the taste still coating your mouth, wondering what on earth you've just agreed to. Somewhere out there the frogs are laughing at you. The shaman drinks first. This is not mere tradition. The shaman entering the ceremonial space ahead of the participants, already navigating the medicine's terrain before anyone else has even swallowed their portion, was considered essential for safety. By drinking first and drinking regularly throughout long ceremonies, the shaman maintained their own access to the ceremonial reality, the interior landscape they were responsible for monitoring. They needed to be there, in that space, in order to do their work. But they also needed to be functional, present, and in control enough to look after everyone else. This required a lifetime of practice, because staying operational in the middle of an ayahuasca ceremony while everyone around you is having the most intense experience of their lives is not something you manage on your first try. The dose given to participants varied considerably, depending on tradition, on the shaman's assessment of the individual, and on the intended purpose of the ceremony. Some people received more, some less, and the shaman's judgment about who needed what was itself a form of expertise, an ongoing reading of each person's state and need. First-time participants typically received a conservative amount, on the theory that knowing nothing about the territory was reason enough for a smaller initial serving. People who had worked with the medicine many times might receive more. People the shaman had some concern about might receive less, or none at all. There was no one-size dosing in the traditional context, because that would have been as absurd as giving every patient in a clinic the same prescription regardless of their condition. And then you are back on your mat with the taste in your mouth, and the jungle outside, and the darkness all around, and the shaman somewhere in the room making the sounds of final preparation. The brew sits in your stomach, dense and heavy, and already making itself known in ways you cannot quite describe. Not effects yet, just presence. The sense of something settling in, getting comfortable, making arrangements. In the traditions, this is already the beginning. The medicine is already working, already reading you, already deciding what kind of night you're going to have. You just have not found out yet. Here is the cruel joke at the center of the whole experience. Nothing happens right away. You drink the most intense substance of your life. You brace yourself for immediate cosmic fireworks, and instead you get 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes longer, of absolutely nothing. Just you, the dark, the jungle, and a mounting suspicion that maybe it did not work. Maybe you are immune. Maybe you are the one person on Earth this simply does not affect. This is, of course, the exact moment it decides to begin. The traditions knew this waiting well and treated it as part of their process. A quiet threshold, the last calm before the real journey. It's a bit like standing at the top of a roller coaster, listening to the mechanism click, telling yourself confidently that it does not feel that high, right up until the floor disappears. The 20 to 40 minutes of waiting were not empty. The mind, knowing what it had just consumed and unable to see anything in the dark, had a tendency to become extremely active during this period, filling the silence with anticipation, with second-guessing, with a particular flavour of regret that arrives in the stomach alongside something you chose to swallow and cannot now unchoose. People described lying on their mats, cataloguing every sensation, trying to determine whether what they felt was the medicine or simply the power of suggestion, which was itself futile because by this point the distinction had become largely academic. Something was building. You could feel it in the way you feel weather before it arrives, a change in pressure, a quality of attention in the body that had not been there before. In the darkness, with eyes open or closed, it did not much matter. The first indications were often subtle enough to be mistaken for imagination. A slight shift in how the black appeared, a gentle brightening at the edges of the visual field, some movement that was not quite movement. People with experience knew these as signs and settled into them calmly. People without experience often sat up straighter, looked around the room for something that was not there, and then lay back down, trying to remember what the shaman had told them about not fighting it. Relaxing into something of entirely unknown intensity while lying on a mat in total darkness in a jungle is, it should be noted, not a skill most people come in with. It is the first thing the medicine teaches you. The lesson is not gentle. The beginning of the effects, when they came all at once or nearly so, and the period of waiting ended not with a fade but with a step. One moment you are a person lying in the dark with a bad taste in your mouth and a racing mind. Then something shifted, something fundamental and irrevocable, and whatever you thought you knew about the inside of your own head was immediately, obviously and completely up for renegotiation. The roller coaster had gone over the edge. The mechanism had released. The night had begun in earnest. Let's address the bucket in the room. For most people, one of the very first things ayahuasca does is make them violently, thoroughly sick, and rather than being an embarrassing side effect, this is considered by the traditions to be the whole point, or at least a central part of it. They call it la purga, the purge, and it is framed not as your body rejecting the medicine, but as the medicine cleaning you out, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and, let's be honest, gastrointestinally. Participants are handed their own personal bucket for exactly this reason, and using it is not shameful, it is expected. In the traditional view, You're expelling illness, grief, old sadness, and whatever heaviness you've been dragging around for years. In the practical view, you're being extremely unwell in the dark next to strangers. Both things are true at once. Bring napkins. The purge was so central to the traditional understanding of the ceremony that in some regions the brew itself was called the purge, using that word as a primary description of what it did. This was not a euphemism. The physical process of vomiting was understood as not merely incidental but integral, a necessary expulsion that made space for what the medicine wanted to bring in. You could not receive the healing the tradition held without first letting go of what was in the way, and sometimes what was in the way had apparently been sitting in your energetic body for decades, waiting for exactly this kind of insistent invitation to leave. The bucket was not a regrettable feature, it was the first tool. The experience of purging in ceremony was reported by many participants as oddly cathartic in ways that ordinary illness never was. Where being sick in everyday life felt merely miserable and pointless, the purge in ceremony felt to many people purposeful. There was a sensation of release that went beyond the physical, as though the body were clearing something that had no simple anatomical address. People cried while vomiting, which sounds awful, and apparently felt strangely, appropriately necessary. Others reported feeling dramatically lighter in the immediate aftermath, cleaner in a way that had nothing to do with hygiene. Whatever the mechanism, something was moving, and the bucket was the evidence. It was also worth noting for the purely practical among us that the brew itself was quite hard on the body independent of anything ceremonial. It was a potent, bitter, concentrated plant extract consumed on an empty stomach in a warm, humid environment by a person already emotionally activated. That alone would make most people sick. Add the pharmacological activity, the emotional upheaval, and the ceremonial intensity, and you had a combination that the human body processed noisily and with considerable conviction. There was no way around it. The traditions did not try to breed it out or eliminate it through technique. They simply handed everyone a bucket, reminded them that discomfort was information, and let the medicine do its work. And then, once your body has been thoroughly emptied, the visions arrive. This is the part everyone came for, and it is also the part nobody can properly describe afterward, though that will not stop them from trying at great length at dinner parties. It often starts with geometry, intricate patterns blooming and folding behind closed eyes, colours that people insist they have never seen before and cannot name. Then it can deepen into full landscapes, scenes, figures, entire narratives that feel more real and more meaningful than waking life. Some people meet what they describe as intelligences, presences, teachers. Some revisit their childhoods. Some are shown things about themselves they have spent decades carefully not looking at. It is intensely personal and impossible to predict, which is precisely why the shaman and the songs matter so much. You do not drive this car. You are, at most, a very interested passenger. The geometry phase, when it appeared, was almost universal across accounts and across cultures. Even people who had no prior information about what ayahuasca was supposed to do reported beginning with visual patterns of such complexity and beauty that describing them felt hopeless. They were three-dimensional. They moved with evident intention. They responded in some accounts to the shaman's songs, brightening or shifting as the melody changed. They were not random noise from an overstimulated visual system, or at least they did not feel that way. They felt organized, purposeful, as though the first thing the medicine did was demonstrate via pure geometry that there were patterns underneath ordinary reality that you normally lacked the resolution to see. Welcome, the patterns seemed to say. Look how much has been here all along. From geometry, the experience typically expanded outward or inward, depending on your preferred direction of metaphor. Into full scenes, populated and detailed and emotionally charged in ways that waking life rarely managed. People found themselves in jungles that were somehow realer than the jungle they were physically lying in cities they had never visited, in their childhood homes with details they had forgotten or thought they had forgotten, in the presence of deceased relatives who spoke with an emotional accuracy that made the word hallucination feel wholly inadequate, in vast spaces that had no physical referent, that were simply enormous and full of meaning and impossible to map once you came back. The visions did not come with an instruction manual. They came with the full weight of experience and required interpretation that could take months or years of waking life to complete. Throughout all of it, the shaman was singing, and in ways that participants found remarkable and sometimes inexplicable, the songs interacted with the visions, not randomly but responsively. When the music shifted, the visionary landscape shifted with it. When the shaman addressed a participant directly, the visions of that participant frequently responded, brightening or clearing or changing direction. Whether this was genuine energetic communication between the shaman and the participant's inner state, or simply the brain finding pattern and narrative in whatever sensory information arrived, the experiential result was the same: the feeling of being guided, the feeling that you are not alone in this vast interior territory, that someone who knew the terrain had their eyes on you. In the dark, with the jungle outside and the visions blooming behind your eyes, that feeling was, by all accounts, something close to essential. Across an astonishing number of ayahuasca experiences, across different people, different centuries, and different cultures who never met one another, the same image keeps showing up: the serpent. Enormous snakes, coiling and uncoiling, made of light or scales or pure pattern, appearing again and again in the visions and woven all through the traditional art and mythology of the region. Skeptics say the mind simply reaches for a primal, deeply wired symbol. The traditions say the serpent is real, a spirit, a teacher, sometimes a mother figure who runs the whole show. Whatever the truth, the consistency is genuinely eerie. When enough strangers separated by thousands of miles all report meeting the same giant snake in the dark, you start to understand why the people who drink this brew treat it with such profound and careful respect. It is not the kind of thing you take lightly twice. In Amazonian traditions, serpents are not the symbols of evil or temptation that they became in certain other mythologies. They are teachers, healers, and guardians of the forest. They are associated with water and with the regenerative power of shedding skin and beginning again. In many traditions, the spirit of the ayahuasca vine itself appeared in visions as a serpent, enormous and iridescent, whose appearance meant you were in direct contact with the medicine at its most fundamental level. Meeting the serpent was not considered frightening in the traditional context, though it certainly could be for unprepared visitors. It was considered auspicious, meaningful, a sign that the medicine was working at depth, and that whatever you were about to be shown would be worth the showing. The anthropological literature on this subject is remarkable for what it reveals across cultures. Researchers who studied Amazonian ayahuasca, visions, and then compared notes with researchers working in entirely different traditions that used different plants in different parts of the world, found serpent imagery appearing with a consistency that was difficult to explain through cultural transmission alone. People in clinical settings with no knowledge of Amazonian traditions reported serpents. People in entirely different cultural contexts reported serpents. The serpent seemed to be, in some way that neuroscience has not fully accounted for, a recurring feature of certain altered states, an image that the mind reached for in this particular territory, regardless of what cultural maps it had been given to read from. Whether the serpent was a projection of the human nervous system reaching toward its deepest metaphors, or whether it was exactly what the tradition said it was, something with independent existence in a dimension that ordinary consciousness did not access, nobody can say with certainty. That uncertainty itself is worth sitting with. Modern science has a great deal of equipment for measuring what happens in the brain during these experiences. It has rather less equipment for resolving the question of whether what a person encounters in ceremony has an existence independent of the brain encountering it. The traditions had a clear and calm answer to that question. The laboratory is still working on it. In the meantime, the serpent keeps showing up, uninvited, consistent, and apparently with a great deal to say. Strip away the serpents and the geometry, and a great deal of the ayahuasca experience comes down to something far less glamorous and far more difficult, being forced to sit with yourself. People consistently report that the brew drags up memories, regrets, relationships, and buried feelings they had spent years successfully avoiding, and then it holds them right up to the light and refuses to let go. It has been described as years of therapy compressed into one long, brutal night, though your therapist probably will not hand you a bucket. For the traditions, this was the healing, the confrontation, the reckoning, the airing out of things gone stale in the dark corners of a life. For the participant, it could be shattering, cathartic, terrifying, and freeing, sometimes all within the same hour. Turns out the scariest thing in the jungle is usually just your own unfinished business. The medicine had a quality that people described as intelligent selectivity. It did not simply scatter memories or emotions at random. It surfaced things in an order, and with a context that felt, even in the moment, purposeful. The childhood scene that arrived unbidden carried the emotional charge it had been holding for 30 years, and it arrived at the precise moment when something else in the experience had opened a door that made working with that charge possible. This was not the diffuse emotional turbulence of a bad dream. It was specific. It was targeted. It was the kind of thing that made rational people lying on jungle mats in the dark begin to wonder, seriously and with full sobriety of mind, whether something was making decisions about what they needed to see. For many participants, the experience of confronting buried material in ceremony was the most valuable thing they had ever done, measured in terms of what changed afterward. Grief that had been locked away surfaced and could finally be expressed. Anger at parents long dead could be acknowledged and released. Patterns of behaviour that had run for decades without being examined were suddenly visible from a perspective wide enough to see their roots and, crucially, their costs. People reported forgiving people they had not consciously realised they were still holding a grudge against. People reported understanding, with a clarity that shocked them, exactly how they had ended up in the circumstances they were currently living and what they would need to do differently. It was not comfortable knowledge, but it was often freeing in a way that nothing else had managed. The traditions framed all of this not as side effect but as primary purpose. The medicine healed by showing you what needed to be seen. The vision was the treatment. The difficulty was the door. And the morning after, when the night had finished and the ordinary world reasserted its familiar shapes, what remained was not trauma but something closer to clarity, a cleaned-out quality, like a house after a serious renovation, all the old furniture gone and the rooms suddenly full of light. That was the healing. Not the fireworks, not the serpent, not the geometry. The quiet, difficult, irreplaceable work of meeting your own mind and surviving the introduction. There is no fast-forward button. Once the brew takes hold, you are committed to the full journey, which can stretch across many hours, and there is no getting off partway through. Time itself becomes unreliable, stretching and folding until a single minute feels like an afternoon, and an hour vanishes in a blink. Participants describe waves, surges of intensity that rise and crash and rise again, moments of overwhelming beauty followed by stretches of difficulty followed by unexpected calm. Somewhere in the middle of it, many people hit a point of exhaustion where they simply want it to stop, want to go home, want their ordinary boring life back with a desperation they have never felt for anything. And still the night continues, and still the songs carry on. The only way out, as the traditions gently remind you, is through. The wave pattern, so consistently reported that it mounted to a reliable structure, meant that the ceremony had a rhythm, even if that rhythm was invisible from inside it. Peaks of intensity came and went. In the valleys between them, brief windows of relative calm appeared, enough to breathe, to reorient, to remind yourself that this was temporary and that you had chosen it and that the shaman was still singing somewhere in the dark. These windows were not comfortable. They were the eye of a storm and everyone in them knew it. But they were enough to keep going, and keeping going was, in the traditional understanding, exactly what was required. The medicine was not done, it had more to show. The willingness to continue was itself part of the practice. The point of wanting it to stop, which arrived for many people around the 3rd or 4th hour, was understood in the traditions as a threshold rather than a signal to retreat. It was the moment when ordinary resistance had exhausted itself, when the defences that protected the parts of the self that needed to be looked at had finally run out of strategies. What came after that surrender was often described as the most significant part of the entire experience, the opening that the whole prior difficulty had been building toward. The traditions called this kind of surrender letting go, and they treated it as a skill that could be practiced and refined across many ceremonies. The first time, for most people, it was neither graceful nor voluntary. It was simply the recognition that resistance was futile and exhausting, and that whatever was on the other side of it could not possibly be worse than continuing to fight. By the final hours, as the intensity began genuinely subsiding rather than merely resting between waves, a quality of spaciousness arrived that participants described as almost incomparably peaceful. Not the peace of numbness, but the peace of something being finished. The shaman's songs grew quieter, gentler, winding down with the same deliberateness with which they had opened. The jungle outside was still singing, but differently now, in the first frequencies of pre-dawn. People on their mats were still, hollowed out and wide open and quietly, irrevocably changed. The long night was ending. Whatever it had brought was theirs to carry now, out of the ceremony and back into the world for the rest of their lives. While participants are off having the most intense experience of their lives, the shaman is emphatically not. The shaman stays present, alert and working, moving through the dark, singing, watching, and tending to each person as needed, functioning essentially as a spiritual lifeguard for a pool full of people who are all, in various ways, drowning beautifully. If someone slipped into a frightening place, a difficult vision, a spiral of panic, it was the shaman's job to sing them back, to shift the energy of the room, to redirect the whole invisible weather system of the ceremony. This is why doing it alone was, and is, considered genuinely dangerous. Without an experienced guide, there is no one to pull you back when the night turns sharp. The lifeguard does not get to enjoy the water. The lifeguard keeps everyone from disappearing under it. The shaman's attention during ceremony was not the kind that rested. It was constantly moving, reading the room with a perceptual sensitivity that years of training had sharpened to something well beyond ordinary observation. They watched the breathing of participants, the sounds they made, the postures they held. They attended to the energetic quality of the room in ways that were experiential rather than analytical. A felt sense of how things were moving, what was stuck, what needed to shift. When someone was struggling, The shaman often knew before the person themselves made a sound. The song changed. The approach changed. The focus of attention moved across the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times in many conditions and had learned to trust their own reading of a situation. When a participant began what the traditions called a bad trip, a spiral into fear or paranoia or overwhelming darkness, the shaman's tools were precise and practiced. They might approach physically, using the shakapa fan to cleanse the energy around the person, singing directly to them rather than to the room as a whole. They might blow mapacho smoke over the person, and act understood as protective and grounding in equal measure. They might simply hold space alongside, present and steady, singing the person through the difficult passage until something gave way. In rare cases of genuine crisis, the shaman could bring someone fully back from the ceremonial state through specific interventions, songs and techniques designed to close what the ceremony had opened before it was supposed to close. This required expertise, confidence, and the kind of calm that only came from having navigated many difficult nights before without losing anyone. What the shaman absolutely could not do was panic. Panic was contagious in a room full of people, with every emotional defense temporarily disassembled, and a shaman who lost their footing in a difficult ceremony could transform a challenging night into a dangerous one very quickly. The equanimity that experienced shamans maintained in the midst of collective emotional chaos was, in many ways, their most critical skill. Not the knowledge, not the songs, not even the years of training, but the quality of stillness they could hold at the center of the storm. Participants on the other side of the difficult ceremonies frequently described the shaman's voice as the thing that saved them. Not what the words meant. The voice, its steadiness, its continued presence in the dark. Eventually, mercifully, the dawn comes. The intensity fades. The visions recede. The jungle quiets into its softer morning voice, and participants are left blinking in the early light, wrung out, hollowed, and often strangely peaceful. But the traditions insist the ceremony does not actually end when the effects wear off. What comes next is integration, the slow work of making sense of what happened, of carrying whatever you learned back into ordinary life without immediately losing it. People describe feeling lighter, clearer, sometimes tearful, sometimes deeply grateful, sometimes just very, very hungry after all that fasting and purging. The insights that felt world-shattering at 3 a.m. have to survive contact with breakfast, and with Monday, and with the long, unglamorous stretch of regular life. The night is dramatic. The integration is where the real, boring, difficult work quietly begins. The morning after a ceremony had a distinctive quality that experienced participants recognized and tried to protect. The world looked different, not in any hallucinatory sense, but in the way that things looked when you just finished crying deeply, and your eyes were clean, and everything had slightly more definition than usual. Colours were vivid, small details were touching. The sound of birds in the surrounding trees was not background noise, but something that asked for and received attention. People moved slowly and gently, as though their nervous systems were newly installed and still finding calibration. Most did not speak much. There was not much to say that words were adequate for, and the traditional space around the morning after was usually one of quiet, food if wanted, and unhurried reflection. Integration was the word the traditions and later the clinical researchers both landed on for the process of making a ceremony meaningful across time. The insight experienced at 3 a.m. that seemed absolute and permanent had a tendency, without active effort, to fade. Not the memory of it exactly, but the felt quality of it. The emotional access to what had been opened. Like a dream that recedes as the day advances, the ceremony's gifts had to be worked with deliberately in order to be kept. This meant different things in different traditions, specific practices, specific conversations with the shaman, specific restrictions maintained in the days following. In modern therapeutic contexts, it meant journaling, therapy, conscious behavioral change. In both cases, the understanding was identical. The night gave you the material. What you did with it was entirely up to you. The honest cost of integration was that it was work, and unglamorous work at that. The revelatory experience of the ceremony was in some ways the easy part. It arrived, and it happened, and it was overwhelming, and then it ended. What remained was the slower, quieter task of actually changing, of taking the thing seen in the dark and applying it in the daylight to the specific people and circumstances and patterns that made up an actual human life. This was where many people stalled. The ceremony had been profound. The Monday after was just Monday, and Monday did not care what you had seen in the jungle. It had its own agenda. The real measure of what the medicine had given you was not the night itself, but what you were willing to do with it once the sun came up. It is worth stopping to underline something, because the modern world constantly forgets it. In the traditional Amazonian context, ayahuasca was never recreation. Nobody was drinking it to have a fun Friday. It was medicine in the fuller sense, used to diagnose and treat illness, to resolve conflicts, to make decisions, to communicate with the unseen, and to heal wounds that were emotional and spiritual as much as physical. The whole apparatus of restriction, ceremony, song, and guidance existed precisely because this was serious business with serious stakes. Treating it as a thrill ride, the traditions would say, is not just disrespectful but genuinely risky. Like wandering into an operating theatre because you heard the lighting was interesting. The bitterness, the purging, the difficulty, none of it was a bug. It was the medicine doing exactly what medicine, in that worldview, was supposed to do. The concept of medicine in the Amazonian tradition operated at a scale considerably larger than the Western pharmaceutical model. It addressed not just the presenting symptom, but the whole system, the person in relation to their family, their community, their history, and the invisible forces the tradition understood as playing active roles in health and illness. A person who came to a shaman with a persistent cough was not necessarily treated for a lung complaint. They were assessed as a whole, being embedded in a whole context, and the treatment was whatever that context required, which might be a medicinal plant, might be a ceremony, might be some combination of specific things that addressed different layers of the problem simultaneously. The cough was a signal. The real question was what it was signalling. This integrative understanding had concrete practical implications. The shaman was not trying to be all things. They were operating from a worldview in which physical and non-physical dimensions of health were not separate categories, but aspects of one continuous reality, and in which treating one without attending to the other was incomplete at best and counterproductive at worst. The dieta, the ceremony, these songs, the follow-up restrictions, all of it was medicine, each element contributing to an outcome that none of them could achieve alone. Stripping out the ceremony and just administering the brew, or doing a ceremony without the preparation, was not a shortcut. It was something different, with different results and different risks. For the people who had grown up with this tradition, none of this required argument. It was as self-evident as the idea that you wash your hands before surgery. The whole apparatus had been tested across generations, refined, and maintained because it worked. When outsiders arrived with the assumption that the active ingredient was simply the brew itself and the rest was cultural decoration, the traditional practitioners had two reactions: polite patience because they had seen this before, and a kind of quiet waiting, because they knew the outsiders would eventually find out one way or another why the decoration was not decorative. So how far back does all of this go? Further than almost anyone expects. Archaeological findings from the region have turned up ancient equipment associated with psychoactive plant preparations, some of it stretching back many hundreds and even thousands of years, suggesting that Amazonian peoples were working with these substances in ritual contexts in the deep, deep past. The brew as we know it, with its clever two-plant combination, has been refined over an enormous stretch of human time, passed down through countless generations of shamans, each adding to a body of knowledge that was never written in a book. When you drink it today, you are, in a sense, participating in one of the longest continuous human traditions still practiced anywhere on Earth. That is a genuinely humbling thought to have while also throwing up into a bucket. Archaeological evidence for the ancient use of psychoactive plants in South America goes back further than the specific chemical fingerprint of ayahuasca. Excavations in the Andes and coastal regions have recovered carved stone mortars, bone-snuffing tubes, and containers bearing traces of various plant compounds, some dating back 2,000 years or more, suggesting that altered states induced by plant medicine were a feature of these cultures long before any written record existed. The precise dating of ayahuasca itself as a combination is harder to establish, because plant material does not preserve well in the humid Amazon, and the brew leaves no durable physical evidence behind. But oral traditions consistently describe it as ancient, as old as the people themselves, which in the Amazon means very old indeed. Linguistic analysis offered another angle. The word ayahuasca and its cognates appear across many distinct Amazonian language groups, embedded deeply in vocabularies that diverged long before European contact. This wide distribution of related terms across languages that had evolved separately for centuries suggested the practice had spread through the region in the deep past, long enough ago that the word itself had time to evolve in different directions while remaining recognizably related. Languages carry history in their bones, and the bones of these languages suggested that this particular practice was not recent, not borrowed from a neighbouring culture within living memory, but ancestral in the full and serious sense of that word. What this antiquity meant for the tradition was a depth of testing that no modern clinical trial could replicate. Every element of the ceremony, every restriction, every protocol had been tried and adjusted and tried again across generations, with the cumulative weight of every outcome informing the next iteration. The things that worked survived. The things that caused harm were identified, named, and warned against. The specific prohibitions and preparations that seemed unnecessary to outside eyes had, in many cases, been arrived at through painful experience in the distant past. The tradition was not static. It had been evolving continuously for as long as it had existed. What it had not been doing was improvising from scratch, and that difference between a practice refined across millennia and one invented last weekend mattered enormously. There is no single tribe that owns ayahuasca, and no one origin story that everyone agrees on. Instead, dozens of distinct Amazonian peoples across a vast territory developed their own relationships with the brew, their own names for it, their own songs, their own ceremonial styles, and their own understandings of what it is and what it does. In one language it is the vine of the soul, in another the vine of the dead, in others something else entirely. Some traditions emphasize healing, others divination, others communion with ancestors or the forest itself. This sprawling diversity is part of why the whole subject resists tidy summary. It was never one thing. It was 1,000 local variations on a shared and ancient theme, a great scattered family of practices bound together by two plants and a very long night. The diversity of ayahuasca traditions across the Amazon was not the kind of diversity that pointed to confusion or inconsistency. It was the kind that pointed to genuine depth, the diversity of a tradition long enough and widespread enough to have developed regional dialects, local emphases, distinct aesthetic sensibilities, and varying relationships with the surrounding ecology. The Shipibo-Canibo people in Peru had their own ceremonial protocols and a visionary art tradition of extraordinary intricacy that used geometric patterns emerging from ceremony to create textiles and paintings of great beauty. The Shuar of Ecuador approached the brew through a tradition that emphasized warrior courage and direct contact with ancestral spirits. The Huni kin used it in intimate family ceremonies that were embedded in everyday social life rather than set apart as exceptional events. Same plants, very different worlds built around them. What unified these traditions across their differences was the fundamental understanding that the plants were teachers, not tools, not chemicals, not means to an end. Teachers, in the full sense that word carries, beings with intelligence, with agenda, with the capacity to assess what a person needed and provide it with an accuracy that exceeded what any human practitioner could consciously organize. This was not metaphor in the traditional context. It was a description of direct experience, repeated across generations by people who had no reason to fabricate it and every reason to take it seriously. The plants taught, the shaman learned, the ceremony transmitted, and the community that organized its life around this practice benefited in ways that its members could articulate at length and with specificity. The variations between traditions also served as a kind of distributed research program. Though the practitioners would not have used those words, different groups had arrived at different emphases through their own long histories of experience with the brew, and those emphases reflected genuine discoveries about what was possible and what was dangerous. Cross-pollination happened slowly, through trade routes and intermarriage, and the occasional exchange of shamans between communities. But each tradition maintained its own coherent approach, its own interpretation, its own body of knowledge, distinct enough to be identifiably itself. This was not one tradition with regional accents. It was a family of traditions with a shared grandmother. For most of its history, ayahuasca stayed almost entirely within the Amazon, unknown to the wider world. That began to change as outsiders pushed into the region, and the early European reactions were, predictably, a mixture of horror, suspicion, and complete misunderstanding. Missionaries and colonizers who encountered the ceremonies tended to view them through a lens of fear, dismissing the whole practice as devilish, primitive, or dangerous, often actively trying to stamp it out. To people who understood plants only as food, medicine, or firewood, the idea of a drink that showed you visions and spoke to your soul was deeply alarming, and their response was frequently to condemn rather than to understand. It would take a very long time and a very different kind of visitor before the outside world started asking what these traditions might actually know that everyone else did not. The missionaries who arrived in the Amazon from the 16th century onward brought with them a framework that left very little room for the traditions they encountered. Any practice involving altered states, visions, and communication with spirits fell into a category that their theology had already named and already condemned. The shamans were sorcerers or devil worshippers by definition, and the brew they used was a satanic instrument. This was not a conclusion reached by examining the evidence. It was a conclusion arrived at in advance and applied to anything that failed to fit the narrow band of acceptable religious experience. The Amazonian people's understanding of what the ceremony was and what it did was not consulted. Their centuries of knowledge were not acknowledged. They were simply wrong by definition and in need of correction. The colonial project in the Amazon did genuine and lasting harm to many of these traditions. Missionary pressure suppressed ceremonies, drove practices underground, and in some cases came close to extinguishing specific traditional knowledge entirely, particularly when it coincided with the deaths of key knowledge holders in communities already devastated by introduced disease. The toll taken on Amazonian peoples by colonization was catastrophic on every dimension, and the attack on their spiritual practices was part of that catastrophe, not a separate matter. What survived did so through secrecy, stubbornness, and the particular resilience of practices that people considered worth protecting with their lives. Not all outsiders were hostile. There were missionaries who became curious, administrators who found themselves fascinated despite themselves, travellers whose assumptions buckled under the weight of direct encounter with something they had no category for. A small number went further, accepting invitations to participate in ceremonies, returning from them changed, and writing accounts that tried to convey to distant readers what they had encountered without quite managing it. These early sympathetic accounts circulated in small numbers, mostly dismissed or ignored, planting seeds that would take another century to germinate. The traditions endured. The world outside eventually came looking. Eventually the naturalist came, notebooks in hand, and the tone shifted from condemnation to curiosity. Travelling botanists and explorers in the 1800s began documenting the vine, collecting samples, and trying to describe to a distant scientific audience what they had witnessed in the jungle. They were fascinated and, frankly, a little baffled. Here was a preparation that clearly did something dramatic, made from plants that on their own did comparatively little, assembled through a process no laboratory had designed. The early scientific accounts are full of a kind of restrained astonishment. Careful men trying to fit an extraordinary experience into the tidy categories of the day, and not quite managing it. They gave the plants their formal names and pressed them into herbarium sheets. But the deeper question, how and why this all worked, would have to wait for chemistry to catch up. The botanist Richard Spruce was among the first to document the vine in a systematic way during his explorations of the Amazon in the 1850s. He collected specimens, took careful notes on the ceremonial context, described the effects he observed in participants, and sent material back to Europe with the meticulous attention of someone who understood they were looking at something significant. His notes were precise, his descriptions of the ceremony respectful in a way that was not entirely typical for the era, and his botanical identification accurate enough to remain useful to researchers working a century later. He was not the only explorer to encounter the brew in this period, but he was among the most thorough, and his published accounts helped introduce the vine to European scientific consciousness in something like its actual character. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a growing scientific interest in the plants of the Amazon generally, driven partly by the practical colonial imperative of identifying economically useful species, and partly by a genuine intellectual fascination with the complexity and novelty of the Amazonian flora. Ayahuasca attracted attention because it was anomalous. It did not fit the existing models of how plant medicines worked. The synergistic combination was puzzling. The ceremonial complexity surrounding it was unusual. The consistency of the effects reported across different observers was difficult to dismiss as mere suggestion. Several researchers attempted chemical analysis with the tools available to them, isolating compounds and naming them, establishing a partial picture of the pharmacology that subsequent researchers would eventually complete. They got some things right. They missed the crucial interaction between the plants entirely and would not understand it for decades. The scientific response to ayahuasca in this period was characteristic of the era's relationship with indigenous knowledge generally, respectful of the plants as objects of study, considerably less respectful of the people whose knowledge had identified those plants and whose centuries of practice constituted the most extensive existing body of evidence about their effects. The ceremonies were documented as curiosities. The shamanic knowledge was occasionally acknowledged but rarely treated as a source of scientific insight. The plants were collected. The knowledge was largely overlooked. It would eventually become clear that this was a significant oversight, one that cost the field many decades of potential understanding. When science finally understood the mechanism, it was almost embarrassing how clever the ancient combination turned out to be. Here, in the gentlest possible terms, is the puzzle. The leaf contains a compound that can produce profound effects, but your own digestive system carries an enzyme that neutralizes it before it ever reaches your brain, so swallowing the leaf alone does essentially nothing. The vine, meanwhile, contains substances that temporarily switch that enzyme off. Put the two together and suddenly the leaf's compound survives the journey and does what it does. It is a two-part biochemical handshake, and the truly staggering thing is that Amazonian peoples worked it out with no chemistry, no equipment, and no theory of enzymes whatsoever, purely through generations of patient, careful observation. Modern researchers, staring at the elegance of it, mostly just take their hats off and quietly admit that somebody, long ago, was paying extraordinary attention. The compound at the centre of all of this was identified by chemists over the course of the 20th century, and found to belong to a family of molecules with a peculiar and somewhat embarrassing property. It was already present in the human brain. In small amounts, as a naturally occurring substance, its function in the brain under ordinary circumstances remains a subject of active research and genuine scientific dispute to this day. What is established is that in the quantities delivered by the brew, with the enzyme that would normally eliminate it temporarily deactivated, it produced the visionary state that the traditions had been describing in careful detail for centuries. The chemistry, once understood, validated the traditional practice in every structural particular. The two-plant combination was not lucky. It was not approximate. It was precise, in the way that a key is precise about the lock it was cut for. The enzyme involved was itself an important part of the story. It lives in the gut and elsewhere throughout the body, and its ordinary job includes breaking down a wide class of chemically similar compounds before they can circulate. Its presence explained the whole mystery of the leaf, why chewing or swallowing that plant on its own produced nothing worth mentioning, while the same plant delivered by other routes that bypassed the gut remained fully active. The enzyme was the gatekeeper, and it did its gatekeeping efficiently. The vine's contribution was to walk up to that gatekeeper and, chemically speaking, convince it to take the night off. Its compound suppressed the enzyme temporarily, opening a window during which the leaf's active molecule could survive digestion, enter circulation, and reach the brain intact. That window lasted several hours, corresponding, with almost suspicious neatness, to the exact duration of the ceremonial experience the traditions described. Consider for a moment what this actually required someone to discover, and consider it slowly, because it does not get less astonishing with repetition. You're in a forest of tens of thousands of plants. You have no concept of an enzyme. You have no concept of metabolism. You have no way of knowing that one plant is inactive by mouth, specifically because of a protein in your own gut, and no way of knowing that a second, completely unrelated plant happens to contain compounds that suppress that exact protein. You have no laboratory, no way to isolate anything, no theoretical framework that would even suggest such an interaction was possible. And yet somehow the correct two plants were identified, the correct preparation was developed, and the knowledge was preserved and transmitted with enough fidelity to survive across an enormous span of generations. Every step of that sequence sits somewhere between improbable and impossible by the standards of random trial and error. And the whole sequence together, working start to finish, is one of the genuinely humbling facts in the entire study of traditional plant knowledge. The scientists who pieced the mechanism together in the middle of the 20th century were, by many accounts, appropriately flawed. Here was a case where the traditional knowledge had not merely gestured vaguely at something later confirmed. It had gotten the specifics exactly right, down to the functional logic of combining precisely these two plant types and no others, in a way that only made sense once you understood a biochemistry the traditional practitioners had no access to. The usual condescension toward folk knowledge, the assumption that traditional practices were bundles of superstition with the occasional accidental hit, did not survive contact with this particular example. The traditional practice was not accidentally correct. It was correct in a way that demonstrated a depth of empirical observation the modern world had badly underestimated. What the chemistry could explain, it explained beautifully. What it could not explain was how anyone had arrived at the combination without the chemistry in the first place. This is the gap that remains, and it is worth being honest about the fact that it is a real gap, rather than a solved problem dressed up as a mystery for dramatic effect. The traditional account is that the plants taught the knowledge directly, communicating their properties to human beings through the visions themselves. The scientific account describes the mechanism with precision, but goes quiet on the question of origin, because the tools of chemistry can tell you how a thing works, without being able to tell you how anyone first found it. Both accounts are describing the same undeniable fact from opposite ends. Something produced this knowledge, and whatever that something was, it was paying closer attention than anyone in a lab coat has ever quite managed to replicate. The Brew's long journey into Western awareness took a strange turn in the middle of the 20th century, when a certain restless generation of writers and seekers went looking for it. Adventurous authors travelled south specifically to try it, and their letters and accounts, passed between friends and eventually published, planted the idea in the Western imagination that deep in the jungle there was a mysterious vine that could crack the mind wide open. These were not scientists or missionaries, but poets and provocateurs, and they wrote about it with a mix of awe, discomfort, and their trademark chaos. The result was a slow-building fascination among a certain kind of curious outsider, the first faint stirrings of what would eventually swell into a full-blown global interest. A jungle medicine, thousands of years old, was about to become of all things fashionable. The writer William Burroughs was among the first from this generation to make a documented pilgrimage specifically to seek out the vine, which he had read about in ethnobotanical literature and become fixated on to a degree that alarmed even his friends, which was genuinely saying something. His journey through South America in the early 1950s, in pursuit of what he called yergi, produced a series of letters to the poet Allen Ginsberg that were later published together. They were strange and uncomfortable and unexpectedly funny, and they were honestly trying to grapple with an experience that his ordinary literary toolkit was simply not built to hold. His accounts were not a glowing endorsement. They read more like a dispatch from the far side of something, vivid and unsettled and refusing to tidy up either the profundity or the misery into something marketable, which, of course, made them irresistible to exactly the sort of reader they were destined to reach. A few years later, Ginsberg made his own journey south and drank the brew himself, and his experience was, by his own account, considerably more harrowing than he had bargained for. He wrote about fear, about confronting death, about being shaken to a degree that his prior enthusiasm had not prepared him for. What is notable, looking back, is that neither writer sold the experience as pleasant. They sold it as significant, which is a different and more dangerous kind of advertisement. Pleasant things attract casual interest. Significant things attract seekers, the sort of people willing to travel a very long way and endure a very difficult night in pursuit of something they cannot quite name. The letters and accounts did not create a market for a good time. They created a rumour of a doorway, and rumours of doorways travel farther and last longer than any ordinary recommendation ever could. The broader cultural ground had already been prepared for this rumour to take root. The Beat Generation's fascination with altered states, running through jazz culture and various experiments with consciousness from the late 1940s forward, had established within a particular literary and intellectual circle the idea that the ordinary waking mind was not the only mode of human experience worth taking seriously, nor necessarily the most revealing one. There was, in other words, already an audience primed to believe that consciousness itself was a frontier, and that the tools for exploring it might come from unexpected places. Into that receptive soil the accounts of the Amazonian vine fell with particular force. Here was something radically more demanding than the substances already circulating in those circles, something arriving from a tradition with real depth and structure, rather than from a laboratory or a street corner, something that seemed to be doing work of a fundamentally different order. The transmission that followed was, it must be said, deeply imperfect. The image of the vine that travelled through the beat and later countercultural literature was frequently more a projection of the Western seekers than an accurate portrait of what the Amazonian traditions actually held. The context got stripped away. The ceremonial framework, the years of a shaman's training, the dieta, the role of the songs, the embeddedness of the whole practice in community and belief, most of that did not survive the journey into paperback. What survived was the exciting part, the promise of a mind cracked open, which is precisely the part that is most dangerous to offer without the rest of the apparatus attached. The seekers who came in the first waves often had wildly romantic ideas and wildly inadequate preparation, and some of them learned the hard way that the doorway the poets had described did not come with a handrail, and yet imperfect transmission was still transmission. The arrival of the idea in Western culture, however garbled, eventually brought people who did their homework, who sought out genuine practitioners, who approached with something closer to appropriate humility, and who came back changed in ways that were verifiable and durable. The poets, for all their chaos and their projections, had done something real. They'd kicked open a door that had stayed closed to the wider world for thousands of years. What poured through after them was a mixed crowd, part serious pilgrim, part thrill seeker, part lost soul hoping the jungle would fix what nothing else had. But the door was open now, and it was not going to close again. The vine had, against every reasonable expectation, become the stuff of literature. Bitter, purging, terrifying literature, but literature nonetheless. Something else remarkable happened in the 20th century. Ayahuasca became the sacrament of entirely new religious movements. Blending Amazonian plant traditions with Christian imagery and other influences, syncretic churches emerged in which drinking the brew was the central act of worship, organized, communal, and deeply structured. These movements grew, spread beyond the Amazon, and eventually won hard-fought legal recognition in various places for their right to use the sacrament in ceremony. It was a genuinely novel chapter, a substance once condemned by colonizers as devilish, now sat at the literal heart of formal religious practice, complete with hymns, congregations, and doctrine. For millions of people, ayahuasca stopped being an exotic curiosity and became, quite simply, church. Bitter, purging, vision-inducing church, but church nonetheless. The Santo Daime was among the first and most influential of these movements, founded in Brazil in the 1930s by a rubber tapper named Raimundo Irineu Serra. known to his followers as Mestre Irineo. His vision of the tradition drew on his own encounters with ayahuasca in the Amazon, his Catholic upbringing, and a series of visionary experiences in which, as he described it, he received direct instructions for the structure of a new church, including its hymns, its rituals, and its entire relationship to the medicine he called daime, a name derived from a Portuguese phrase meaning give me, as in give me light, give me love, give me strength. The movement he founded was organized, communal, and quietly expansive, gathering followers first in his home region in the Brazilian Amazon, and eventually spreading across the country and then well beyond it. It had every structural feature you would expect of a religion: a founding figure regarded with reverence, a body of sacred hymns functioning as scripture, a defined liturgy, a moral code, and a community of practice that understood the shared experience of the brew as the central sacrament of the faith. The hymns deserve particular attention because they reveal how completely the brew had been woven into a genuine devotional structure rather than merely tolerated within one. In the Santa Daime, the hymns are not incidental. They are received, treasured, and sung collectively during ceremonies that can last many hours, and they are understood to carry spiritual instruction and guidance. Members sing together, in formation, often in matching ceremonial dress, moving through the long night of a working with a discipline and order that would be entirely unfamiliar to anyone whose only image of ayahuasca is a solitary seeker prostrate beside a bucket. This was communal worship in the fullest sense, structured and repeated and passed down, with the medicine functioning exactly as bread and wine function in other traditions, as the material substance through which the sacred was understood to become present. The União do Vegetal, another major Brazilian movement, took a somewhat different form. Founded in the 1960s, it was more hierarchical in its organization and more reserved in its early years, but it was equally serious in treating the brew, which it called huasca, as a religious sacrament rather than a medical or recreational substance. The União do Vegetal grew steadily and methodically, and by the early 21st century had established branches in several countries, drawing members from professional and educated populations and cultivating a reputation for order, sobriety, and careful practice. Its members did not understand themselves as drug users. They understood themselves as adherents of a religion whose central rite happened to involve a plant sacrament, and they defended that understanding with considerable resources and conviction when it was challenged. That challenge, when it came, produced one of the more remarkable legal developments in the whole history of the tradition. In the United States, a branch of the União do Vegetal found its sacrament seized by federal authorities under drug law, and the church sued for the right to practice its religion. The case worked its way through the courts and reached the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously in the church's favor in 2006, finding that the government had not demonstrated a compelling enough interest to override the members' right to religious freedom. A plant preparation that was otherwise illegal under federal law had been formally recognized by the highest court in the country as a legitimate religious sacrament deserving of legal protection. It was a stunning reversal of the centuries during which the same practice had been condemned as devil worship, and it reshaped the legal landscape in ways that would have been unimaginable to the missionaries who first encountered the ceremonies and reached immediately for the language of damnation. What these movements demonstrated, taken together, was that the ayahuasca tradition was not simply a spiritual technology that could be extracted from its context and handed to anyone to use alone. It was something that flourished within community, within shared belief, within the ongoing relationship among practitioners who understood themselves as participating in something sacred and larger than their individual experience. The syncretic churches provided exactly that structure in new forms, adapted for new populations and new continents, but they never abandoned the fundamental insistence that the brew was not a thing to be used casually and in isolation. Even dressed in its new religious clothing, complete with hymns and congregations and Supreme Court victories, the tradition held firm on the point it had always made. The sacrament needed a church around it to work as intended, and so, improbably, out of a jungle medicine older than any cathedral, the churches were built. And then came the tourists. In recent decades, ayahuasca has exploded into a global phenomenon, with retreat centers springing up across the Amazon and beyond, promising healing, insight, and transformation to a steady stream of visitors from wealthier corners of the world. Some of these operations are careful, respectful, and run by genuinely knowledgeable people. Others are, to put it kindly, not, staffed by self-declared shamans with a weekend of training and an eye for a profitable market. The whole thing has become an industry, complete with reviews, package deals, and airport transfers, which is a deeply surreal fate for an ancient sacred medicine. There is real healing happening in some of these places, and real recklessness in others, and telling the two apart from a glossy website is close to impossible. Ancient jungle ritual meet modern hospitality economy. It is a strange marriage. The retreat industry began growing in earnest in the 1990s and then accelerated dramatically through the 2000s and beyond, propelled by a convergence of forces that all pointed in the same direction. There was word of mouth from people who had experienced genuine life-altering healing and could not stop talking about it. There was a slowly accumulating body of scientific research suggesting real clinical potential for exactly the kinds of suffering that modern medicine handled poorly. There was a broad cultural moment in which Western interest in non-ordinary states of consciousness was rising sharply, while the conventional sources of such experiences felt increasingly hollow. And there was the plain practical reality that the Amazon was reachable, that affordable flights existed, and that communities near cities like Iquitos in Peru had recognized both the demand and the opportunity and built the infrastructure to meet it. By the 2010s, the ayahuasca retreat had become a recognizable category of experience, something you could find through a search engine, compare across review platforms, and book with a deposit. The economics of this were not trivial, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. For communities with limited options, the arrival of foreign visitors willing to pay substantial sums for ceremonies represented a genuine and in many cases welcome source of income, one that could support families, fund community needs, and allow traditional practitioners to continue their work rather than abandoning it for wage labour in a city. Some of the most respected operations used exactly this model, channeling the income from outsiders back into the communities and traditions that produced the medicine, applying real ceremonial care to everyone who came through, and treating the whole exchange as a legitimate and mutually beneficial meeting between worlds. For the people who found these operations and approached them with adequate preparation and appropriate humility, the experiences on offer were transformative in precisely the ways the tradition had always promised. The trouble was that the quality spectrum within the industry was enormous and almost entirely invisible from the outside. At one end sat those experienced practitioners from intact traditions. At the other end sat operations whose primary qualifications were geographic proximity to the Amazon and a willingness to brew and serve the tea to anyone who paid. These too existed in significant numbers, and the range of what they produced ran from the merely mediocre to the genuinely hazardous. a prospective visitor scrolling through attractive photographs of thatched maloccas and testimonials about spiritual awakening had essentially no reliable way to distinguish a lineage-trained healer with decades of experience from an opportunist who had learned enough to look the part. The website looked the same, the promises sounded the same, the reality behind them could not have been more different. The rise of what came to be called the gringo shaman was one symptom of the boom's less flattering side. Foreign visitors who attended a handful of ceremonies declared themselves qualified and began running their own operations, sometimes with alarming confidence and negligible grounding in any actual tradition. The whole protective apparatus that the traditional context had built up across millennia, the training, the screening, the songs, the community, the accumulated knowledge of what could go wrong and how to respond, was precisely the part most easily discarded in the interest of scaling up and turning a profit. And it was precisely the part whose absence caused the most harm. The traditional communities were vocal about the tensions the boom created, even as they proved largely unable to resolve them. Cultural appropriation, commodification of the sacred, the steady erosion of the ceremony's protective framework in favour of customer satisfaction, the rising numbers of visitors arriving with inadequate preparation and outsized expectations, treating a serious medicine as an item to be consumed on a bucket list holiday. The more thoughtful people working within the industry acknowledged all of this and wrestled with it openly, aware that they were participating in something with genuine ethical weight. The tradition had always insisted from its very foundations that context was not optional decoration, but the load-bearing structure of the entire practice. The retreat boom was, in effect, an enormous uncontrolled experiment testing exactly how much of that structure you could remove before the whole thing came apart. The results of that experiment were still coming in. Some of them were beautiful, some of them were tragic, and almost none of them fit on a brochure. For all the talk of healing, ayahuasca is not gentle, and it is not for everyone, and pretending otherwise has genuinely hurt people. The experience is physically demanding and emotionally overwhelming, and it can be dangerous for those with certain medical conditions or those taking certain medications, because remember, that clever enzyme switching trick works on more than just the leaf. Combining the brew with the wrong substances can turn a difficult night into a medical emergency. On top of that, the boom in unregulated retreats has meant inconsistent safety, untrained facilitators, and real harm to vulnerable people who arrived hoping to be healed. None of this is a reason to sneer at the tradition, which held all of these dangers in careful check for thousands of years through preparation, restriction, and skilled guidance. It is simply a reminder that the safeguards were never decoration. They were the reason anyone survived to do it again. The pharmacological risks were specific, well documented, and directly traceable to the same elegant mechanism that made the whole thing work in the first place. The enzyme that the vine temporarily deactivates in your gut did not exist solely to inconvenience the leaf. It was responsible for metabolizing a broad class of other substances as well, and switching it off had consequences that reached far beyond the intended effect. The most serious concern involved a particular category of antidepressant medication that worked through a related biochemical mechanism. Combining those medications with the brew could produce a dangerous and, in the worst cases, fatal interaction, an overload of a specific neurotransmitter system that the body was suddenly unable to regulate properly. This was not a theoretical hazard raised by overcautious skeptics. It had happened. People had been seriously harmed and in some cases killed by exactly this interaction. The way these tragedies typically unfolded revealed the gap the boom had opened. A person arrived at a retreat carrying prescription medication, either because they had not thought to disclose it, or because no one had asked, or because the facilitator lacked the knowledge to understand why it mattered. In a properly run traditional context, The extended screening and the strict dieta would have caught the problem long before anyone drank anything, because the tradition's prohibitions, arrived at through generations of hard experience rather than through knowledge of enzymes, functioned in practice as exactly the right safety protocol. The traditional practitioner did not know the biochemistry, but they knew with total certainty that certain substances and certain foods and certain states did not belong anywhere near the medicine, and they enforced that knowledge rigorously. An unqualified facilitator running a high-volume operation, by contrast, often did not know the questions to ask, and the consequences of not asking fell on the person who trusted them. Beyond the pharmacological dangers lay the psychological ones, which were subtler and harder to screen for. Ayahuasca could and did surface material that overwhelmed people who were not adequately prepared or supported to receive it. Individuals with personal or family histories of psychosis, individuals in the middle of an active mental health crisis, individuals carrying specific kinds of unresolved trauma with no therapeutic scaffolding to hold them afterward. All of these were categories the traditions recognized and had developed protocols for. Those protocols involved careful individual assessment, modified approaches for people who could proceed safely with adjustments, and the plain, unglamorous willingness to tell someone that they were not ready and should not do this now. A skilled traditional practitioner made these judgments as a matter of routine, reading each person and each situation. An underqualified facilitator with a full schedule and a financial incentive to say yes was in a poor position to make them at all. The physical dangers extended even further into matters that had nothing to do with pharmacology or psychology. The ceremony was long, physically taxing, and conducted in conditions that demanded basic safety infrastructure that could not be assumed. Adequate hydration on hand, someone capable of recognizing and responding to genuine medical distress, and a real plan for reaching professional help if a situation escalated beyond what the setting could handle. The remote Amazonian locations that made retreats feel authentic and immersive were the same locations that placed participants hours or more from any hospital. That distance was not an atmospheric detail to be savoured. It was a concrete risk that responsible operators planned around carefully and irresponsible ones ignored entirely. There were also painfully documented cases of vulnerable participants being exploited by predatory facilitators, another category of harm that the traditional structures of community accountability had historically constrained, and that the anonymous, transactional retreat model too often failed to prevent. None of this, it bears repeating clearly, was an argument against the medicine itself. It was an argument for the tradition that had always surrounded it. Every one of these dangers had been understood, in its own terms, by the practitioners who had worked with the brew across countless generations, and everyone had been held in check by the layered safeguards of preparation, restriction, screening, skilled guidance, and community accountability. The harms of the modern era were, overwhelmingly, harms of subtraction, the predictable results of stripping away the protective framework and keeping only the potent centre. The medicine was not the problem. The absence of everything the tradition had wisely built around the medicine was the problem. The brochure showed the Maloka and the sunrise. It rarely showed the reason the safeguards existed. And the people who found that out the hard way deserved far better than a glossy photograph and a promise. So what do we make of all of this? From the safe distance of a comfortable bed and a soft light and no bucket anywhere in sight. Ayahuasca is many things at once, and it refuses to be any single one of them. It is an ancient medicine and a modern industry, a sacred sacrament and a tourist attraction, a healing practice and a genuine risk, a two-plant chemical marvel, and a mystery that science still cannot fully explain away. It is proof that human beings, given enough time and attention and a rainforest to work with, We'll figure out the most improbable things and then build entire worlds of meaning around them. And whatever you believe about spirits and serpents and the vine of the soul, there is something quietly astonishing about a tradition that has held steady for thousands of years, singing in the dark, tending its fires, and insisting gently but firmly that the only way out is through. The scientific research that had been gathering momentum by the early decades of the 21st century was turning up findings that were, by any reasonable measure, remarkable. Studies conducted in proper clinical settings were showing that the brew produced measurable and durable changes in people suffering from depression, from post-traumatic stress, from addiction. Not modest statistical nudges that required careful squinting to detect, but large, meaningful shifts in the lived experience of people for whom other treatments had failed, and shifts that persisted for months, and in some cases years after only a small number of sessions. The mechanisms were becoming clearer, the chemistry was being mapped with increasing precision, and the clinical outcomes were proving difficult to wave away. A traditional medicine from the Amazon, dismissed as primitive superstition for the better part of 5 centuries, was in certain contexts outperforming the standard treatments that modern medicine had spent enormous resources developing. The people who had known the medicine for generations received this news with, one imagines, a certain amount of patience. What the research had a much harder time capturing was the dimension of the tradition that lived beyond pharmacology, the role of the ceremony itself, the importance of the songs, the particular quality of healing that seemed to occur within a framework of belief, community and spiritual meaning, as opposed to within a hospital room and a signed consent form. Some researchers, following the reflexive logic of reductionism, tried to isolate the active compound and deliver it stripped of all ceremonial context, seeking to extract the medicine cleanly from the tradition, the way one might extract an active ingredient from a plant. The results of this effort were interesting, genuinely useful, and much debated. Some argued that the stripped-down version preserved most of the therapeutic benefit and represented a more scalable path forward. Others argued, with equal data and equal conviction, that the tradition was itself doing therapeutic work that could not be separated from the brew without quietly losing something essential to the outcome. That disagreement was real, active, and unresolved. And the tradition itself, unsurprisingly, had a firm position on it, and was not shy about saying so. There is a deeper question sitting underneath all of this, and it does not resolve neatly in either direction. The story of ayahuasca is, among other things, the story of a body of knowledge that an ancient tradition carried for millennia, and that the modern world flatly refused to take seriously until its own instruments were sophisticated enough to confirm what the tradition had been saying the entire time. That is an uncomfortable pattern to sit with, because it suggests that the confidence with which the modern world dismisses what it does not yet understand may be considerably less well-founded than it feels from the inside. The traditional practitioners were not guessing, and they were not stumbling onto occasional lucky hits amid a fog of superstition. They held detailed, functional, empirically grounded knowledge that predated the tools capable of verifying it by thousands of years. What else, the honest observer is forced to wonder, might be sitting in the world's traditional knowledge, quietly correct, waiting for the instruments to catch up? The tradition, for its part, never needed the vindication and never waited for it. It simply continued, singing in the dark and tending its fires with the same patient care it always had. What the vine leaves behind in the end is a question rather than an answer, and a better one for being unresolved. A question about consciousness, about healing, about the limits of what any single framework can capture, about what human beings know and how they come to know it in the first place. It leaves behind hard evidence that ancient traditions can hold empirical truth the modern world failed to recognize until embarrassingly late. It leaves behind clinical results that are quietly rewriting the treatment of some of the most stubborn forms of human suffering. And beneath all of that, it leaves behind a single durable image, a shaman in the dark, singing. Thousands of years of accumulated care for the wounded human spirit, folded into a melody older than any wall or roof or monument still standing anywhere on the surface of the earth. That is a small miracle, if the word means anything at all. And even from a warm bed, with the lights low and no bucket anywhere in sight, it is worth one last quiet moment of respect before you drift off. So here we are, at the far end of the long night together, and the fire has burned down to embers, and the jungle outside has softened into that hush that comes just before dawn. Let's take a breath and look back at the strange and winding road we've travelled tonight, because it was a longer journey than it seemed when we started, and you've come further than you probably realise. We began with a brew, just that. A thick, dark, unfriendly-looking liquid the colour of wet bark, simmered for hours over an open fire, bitter enough to make a grown adult reconsider several of their life choices in a single swallow. And from that one humble, unpromising cup, we followed the thread outward, and the thread turned out to reach almost everywhere, into a rainforest of 80,000 plants where, against every conceivable odd, someone found the only two that mattered and worked out precisely how to make them speak to one another. Into the quiet, patient lives of the shamans who gave up comfort, company and salt for years at a time so that they could learn the songs the plants were willing to teach. Into the long dark ceremonies themselves with their waiting and their purging and their visions and their serpents, their peaks and valleys, their moments of terror folded into moments of overwhelming beauty. And out the other side, into history and chemistry and colonial fear and beatnik letters and new religions and Supreme Court rulings and glossy retreat brochures and the very real dangers those brochures so carefully leave out. Think, for a moment, about the sheer stubbornness of the people at the centre of all this. Consider what it took to build and keep this tradition alive. They had no laboratories, no written records, no chemistry, no theory of enzymes, no instruments of any kind. What they had was attention. Extraordinary generational life and death attention to a forest that was constantly trying to feed them, poison them, heal them, and kill them, often all at once. They learned their world so thoroughly, so intimately, and across so many patient centuries, that they cracked a biochemical puzzle so precise that when modern science finally caught up and understood the mechanism, the best and brightest researchers could do little more than take off their hats and quietly admit that somebody, a very long time ago, had been paying closer attention than we knew was possible. That knowledge was not written down. It was carried, held in human memory, passed from one careful pair of hands to the next, sung into being night after night in the dark, protected through invasion and suppression, and centuries of being called devilish by people who had never bothered to ask a single honest question. And somehow, through all of it, it survived. And it was not gentle work. Let's be honest about that here at the end. The dieta meant days and sometimes months of hunger and renunciation before a single drop was ever tasted. The ceremony meant a whole night of physical misery, the bucket close at hand, the body wrung out and the mind cracked wide open, and every buried thing you had spent years avoiding rising up to meet you in the dark. There was no fast-forward button, no getting off partway through, no comfortable version. There was only the long night and the patient voice of the shaman singing you across it, insisting gently but without compromise that the only way out was through. These were not people chasing a pleasant evening. They were people doing serious, difficult, ancient work on the deepest wounds a human being can carry, using tools older than almost anything else our species still does. That deserves respect. Real respect. The quiet kind. The kind you feel rather than announce. So tonight, as you lie in your soft bed, warm and dry, with a light you can dim at the touch of a finger and clean water waiting in the next room, and not the faintest whiff of wood smoke or mapacho, or a bucket anywhere in your immediate future, maybe spare a thought for them, for the shaman sitting cross-legged in the pitch black, hour after hour, holding the whole weight of a room full of unravelling souls, singing songs learned across years of lonely apprenticeship, unable to rest, unable to panic, responsible for every person in the dark until the sun came up. For the apprentices who gave up everything ordinary to learn how to do that, for the countless generations who tested and refined and protected this knowledge, who identified every danger through painful experience and built every safeguard for a reason, who kept the vine alive through everything the world threw at it. They did not have your comforts. They did not have your certainty of waking up tomorrow, but they had something we are still, even now, with all our instruments, only beginning to understand. And maybe that is the quiet gift the whole story leaves behind. Not the visions, not the serpents, not even the remarkable healing that clinics are now carefully measuring and finding difficult to argue with. The gift is the reminder that the confidence with which we dismiss what we do not yet understand is so often misplaced. That knowledge does not only live in books and laboratories, that an ancient tradition, singing in the dark in a language most of the world never bothered to learn, can be quietly, patiently, thoroughly correct about things the rest of us only worked out yesterday. There is a humility in that worth carrying with you into sleep. The world is older and stranger and wiser than it usually lets on, and the people who came before us knew a great deal more than we tend to give them credit for. You do not have to believe in plant spirits to feel the weight of that. You do not have to accept a single supernatural claim to be moved by the image of it. Thousands of years of accumulated care for human suffering, folded into a melody older than any wall or roof or monument still standing anywhere on earth. A fire tended through the night, a voice in the darkness, steady and unhurried, promising that whatever you are carrying can be set down, that the difficult passage has an end, that morning always, eventually comes. That is not a small thing. In a world that so often feels loud and rushed and certain of itself, there is something deeply restful about a tradition that simply waits and tends and sings and trusts the slow work to do what it has always done. So let the fire burn down. Let the jungle settle into its softest voice. Let the last of the smoke drift up through the roof and out into the greying sky. You've travelled a long way tonight, through history and chemistry and ceremony, and the deep patient wisdom of people who understood things we're only now remembering how to ask about. There's nothing left to do now but rest. Breathe slow and easy, and through the nose, the way the old ones did on the coldest nights, when survival was a thing you had to work at one gentle breath at a time. Let your body grow heavy. Let the day you carried in with you loosen its grip and slide quietly away. The vine has held its door open for thousands of years, and it is holding it open still, but you do not need to walk through it tonight. Tonight you only need to sleep, warm and safe and grateful, wrapped in comforts that countless stubborn, hopeful, endlessly resourceful people fought and suffered and sang through the dark so that one day someone like you could simply close their eyes and drift off in peace. Rest well, sleep deep, and thank you, as always, for spending this long, strange, beautiful night here with me.